Hello and welcome to this panel discussion here at East AfricaCom 2022. I'm Paula Gilbert. I'm the editor of Connecting Africa. And for this panel today, we are looking at the topic of value of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area for East Africa. Now, we know that Africa has some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and yet trade within the continent is actually the lowest globally. African countries do far more trade with those outside the continent than with their neighbors, but this is all due to change with the advent of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The AfCFTA came into effect in principle in January 2021, but there are still some ongoing negotiations over things like tariffs and rules. Now, the agreement is expected to increase the share of intra-African trade by up to 50% by 2040. The agreement also aims to create a single market for goods and services in order to deepen the economic integration of Africa. The trade area could also have a combined GDP of around $3.4 trillion by bringing together Africa's 1.2 billion people into one trade zone. It will cover not only trading goods and services, but also investment, intellectual property rights, and will most certainly impact tech and telecoms businesses on the continent as well. The free trade area is also expected to benefit small and medium-sized businesses, which are responsible for about 80% of Africa's employment and 50% of its GDP. But of course, it's a hugely complicated agreement with lots of moving parts. So today we're going to find out more from our panel of experts about where exactly we are when it comes to the progress that we are making so far, especially for East Africa. So I am joined by a star-studded panel today. So with me, I have Andrew Mould, who is the Chief of Regional Integration and AfCFTA Cluster at the ECA Office for Eastern Africa for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And I also have Atilia Piri, who is the Lead Attorney for Emerging Markets for Africa, Levant, and Pakistan at Microsoft. Welcome, both of you. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm really excited for what I think is going to be a great discussion. If anyone watching in the audience has any questions for our panelists, please put them into the chat feature, which is on the right-hand side of the video, and the panelists will be able to type replies to you in the chat there to any questions you have during the session. All right, so before we jump into questions, I think I'll just give the panelists a little opportunity for a brief, maybe 1-minute intro on themselves and kind of how they fit into this topic. So Atilia, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Paula. Really glad to be a part of this panel. Discussions around the Continental Free Trade Agreement are probably some of the most important that I'm a part of currently. It's something that is very close to my heart, being an African. But yeah, from a role perspective, I'm the Principal Corporate Counsel for Microsoft for the region you've described. But my role also crosses over to what would be typically done by government affairs professionals. So on the policy and regulatory affairs side, I support engagements around developments in the regulatory and policy landscape that impacts technology companies like Microsoft. And so we spend a lot of time speaking about data protection regulations, the upcoming, the cybersecurity regulations in different countries and the like. So that's my interest, at least, in this panel conversation today.
Okay, wonderful. And Andrew, I mean, your title is quite a mouthful, so tell us a bit about what all of that actually means.
Yes, good morning. Yes, in my particular case as well, I'd say, like Atilia, it's regional integration is something very close to my heart. I'm not an African national, but actually, in fact, I'm a national of the country which is probably currently least qualified to talk about the benefits of regional integration, because I'm originally a national from the United Kingdom. But I often say in my presentations, precisely because of Brexit, I understand what's at stake when either you don't go ahead with a regional integration process or you decide to pull out of one. So ECA does a lot of work supporting the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is a long-standing ambition for the continent. My colleagues in the African Trade Policy Centre in Addis Ababa, they work directly with the AfCFTA Secretariat. And here in Eastern Africa, we've made it the area of specialization for our office in terms of providing support for the Continental Agreement here, partly because we feel that although parts of the East Africa region have made good progress, for example, in the East Africa community in terms of regional integration, there's a lot more to do. So, for example, the two largest economies in our sub-region are Kenya and Ethiopia, and yet the levels of trade between them is extremely low currently. So these are the kind of things that I think need to be addressed under the Continental Free Trade Area going forward, and that's where we provide the bulk of our technical support.
Okay, wonderful. I'm going to stay with you just to kind of give us a bit of an overview. I think some of the audience will know a lot about, the free trade area, and some people might not. So maybe you can set the scene for us a bit. Where exactly are we in terms of the whole process, and how is it actually impacting, East African trade so far?
Okay, well, it's not currently impacting East African trade because at a continental level, although some consignments of trade were sent, I believe, from Ghana to South Africa in January 2021. That was rather more symbolic. And actually, we haven't really got into the operational phase of the Continental Free Trade Area Agreement yet. Things have been a little bit postponed, of course, because of the COVID crisis and the pandemic. And of course, attentions of policymakers went elsewhere for a while. In some sense, it was facilitated as well because a lot of the consultations and the negotiations, for example, about rules of origin were actually carried out online because of the COVID restrictions. And actually that facilitated things for a lot of member states as well. So there was a positive side to that. Yeah. The outstanding issue at the moment are the rules of origin negotiations, which are completed to about 88%, but there's two subsectors which are really causing some difficulties in terms of reaching conclusions. And those are in textiles and clothing on the one hand, and automobiles. The bulk of the rules of origin which are outstanding are actually, it's textiles and clothing. It accounts for about 10%. Once those negotiations are concluded, the services trade component also needs to be completed, but we would be ready for trading, basically. So I think member states are waiting in, with a lot of anticipation now for things to actually go into the operational stage.
Yeah, but on the positive side, I mean, there's been a lot of buy-in, right, from majority of the AU countries.
Oh, well, I mean, it's an amazing degree of majority opinion here. We've got 54 of the 55 AU member states have agreed to the Continental Free Trade Area, and now we have 44 member states which have actually ratified through their parliaments or through their legislative procedures the agreement. So on a political level, progress has been really quite impressive. I mean, if you compare it, for example, with the European Union single market, that was decided to take action in '86, and it took them until 1993 to actually put it into operation. So actually the continent's been moving much faster with a much larger number of member states. So that's quite impressive in that sense.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much for that sort of overview. It's a great place to start for us. Attilia, maybe from your point of view, what are the opportunities, presented by the AFCFTA for a company like Microsoft?
That's a great question. And I like to think of it in this way. Microsoft is a technology company. Really at the core of it, we're positioning ourselves as a platform, a technology platform that then enables others to be able to do great things with that technology, right? And the idea is the more people we can enable, the better business that we do, right? And so the ability for us to scale up our business across the continent, I think, is one clear opportunity for Microsoft as a company, but as well, similarly for many other technology companies. I think we've seen an increase in the investments coming from as in foreign investment into the region, particularly around digital technology and digital infrastructure. The likes of Microsoft and Amazon have had data centers on the continent. I think the first data centers we've seen have landed in South Africa, but we're seeing an increase in an interest in investment in digital infrastructure. And I think that will continue to grow. That's a clear opportunity in the technology space. I think as well, the other opportunity that many companies are looking at or rethinking, the youth population on the continent is really something that's quite extraordinary. Many people are starting to actually say that, if you look at the youth population and how it will continue to grow in the next, 5, 10, even if you look forward 30 years, what that means is that there's a lot of talent that you could garner from the African continent. So you've also seen people start to make investments in human capital and And from our end, this looks like investing in technology skills, but then as well setting up engineering facilities where we're hiring a lot of engineers. Microsoft has been running what we call the Africa Development Center probably for the last 3 years. And now we've seen our peers as well. Google in the last couple of weeks has mentioned that they are also launching a similar facility. And so you'll start to see people also looking to leverage human capital. And the scale at which you can, operationalize engineering facilities like that, tapping into the talent pool across the continent is something that is making it attractive for people. Maybe the other thing that I would say is a real opportunity as well from a practical perspective, right? And this is something that integration really helps. Typically, as you're doing business from country to country, what you would do is you would, before you even go into a country, you do a feasibility. Can I make an investment in this country? What would it take for me to set up, et cetera, et cetera? And there's quite complex steps that any business has to do for market entry purposes. And this makes it very difficult for you to scale across different markets very quickly. But if there's an integration across the continent, imagine just the reduction in the barriers of entry and just the ease at which not just Microsoft, but as well those who are leveraging our technology would be able to scale up. And so I think from a practical perspective, that's a real opportunity that we're all looking forward to. So those are some of the 3 top things I would say private sector is looking to as an opportunity in this space.
Okay, amazing. Thanks so much. I mean, Andrew, Atelia's spoken a bit about kind of the digital side and those opportunities. For you, what are the major opportunities you see, the positive changes that this trade area will bring? And then also maybe what have been the big problems in the negotiations, like the biggest issues that people have been struggling to get over?
Yes, well, I mean, clearly, as Otelia was saying, the promise of reducing the barriers to intra-African trade is very important. I must take issue actually with one point you said at the beginning, that currently intra-African trade is very low, and I know this is commonly said in a lot of forums. The figures go around of 16% of total trade, 17%. I think those figures are actually quite misleading, and actually you'll find that intra-continental trade is actually very vibrant across many parts of the continent. Okay. The continental figure is dragged down for one particular reason, that the continent is also very rich in natural resources, and the target markets for those natural resources is logically enough outside the continent. But if you make a comparison, for example, with Mercosur in Latin America, which is another regional bloc which comprises of Brazil and Argentina, they're both commodity exporters as well, and you see the intra-regional level of trade is actually lower than in most African regional economic communities. If we also factor into the fact that a lot of cross-border trade is currently informal across the continent, we add those figures in, you start to see that actually a lot of countries are very highly dependent on the continental market already. But definitely the continental free trade area is going to potentialize that further. And I think a very important aspect to the agreement is the way it's going to facilitate as well cross-border investment, because cross-border investment is one of the most rapid ways of increasing intra-regional trade as well. And the final thing I'm going to say is that Otelia mentioned, the youth of the population across the continent as one of its most important assets. The free movement protocol is fundamental, I think, for this agreement as well to work properly. And young people will find a lot of opportunities through being able to work in other member states across the continent. That's less discussed. It's definitely true that member states were a little bit more cautious about the free movement protocol than they were about the trade or investment protocols. We very much insist that it's part and parcel of this agreement, and to make it work effectively, then you need the free movement protocol also to come into action. I believe the figures could be slightly off now, but I believe 27 member states signed up to the free movement protocol, but currently only 4 have ratified it. So, there's work to be done in that area.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Very interesting. It's always good to know that there's actually more trade going on than we think there is. And the informal market, can't be ignored for sure. So Otelia, obviously a big all the big changes, a lot of it has to do with policy reforms, right? If we're going to get these kind of things right. So yeah, sort of legally speaking, what are some of the issues that have come into play there, specifically when we're talking about tech companies in the market?
And this is where I spend most of my time.
I'm sure.
Probably a good portion of my day is spent in conversations in this regard. And I'd say the key conversation, and if you take what Andrew has been saying around, there's the trade promoting protocols, there's the free movement of persons, the framework that's needed there. There's as well one around how data or information flows in between the countries as well, right? And there's currently a digital protocol that as well that is in the works. And I think the thinking here, or at least what the technology companies would be looking to, is that we need to have a openness across border data flows that are freely moving across the continent. And what we've seen is most countries on the continent have been either developing data protection regulations, cybersecurity guidance, or any other form of guidance that speaks to data needing to remain within their countries. And their motivation for this is an element of the feeling that if they can have the data within their boundaries, then they have control over it, and that they can have, as in they can protect their sovereignty as a state, something which is almost counterintuitive in this digital ecosystem that we're all operating in, right? As in the nature of the internet is global, the nature of a lot of digital infrastructure is global, and for you to be able to participate in the digital economy almost necessitates that you need to have an openness for the free movement of data. So I think the one area that we're hoping will continue to advance as well as a part of these conversations is clarity around cross-border data flows. We've seen the AU issued Continental data framework, and that speaks to the issues like cross-border data flows and data governance and how that should be managed within this new digital economy space. And so there are elements of work that is ongoing within that space, but I think that's one policy area that we're really hoping we can get clarity to, so that technology companies can enjoy the full extent of the agreement when it operationalizes.
Yeah. And Andrew, kind of from your perspective, where do these tech and telecoms kind of companies fit in, and what kind of opportunities does it bring to that industry? Where are we in those kind of negotiations? I know that it was the services kind of stuff, or at least the tech stuff was supposed to be in phase one, but yeah, you're the expert, you'll know all the nitty-gritties.
Yes, I mean, services trade for the continent has become increasingly important, and I think particularly for countries in Eastern Africa. So whereas countries in our region, they tend to show large merchandise trade deficits, in a number of cases, they show nearly positives in terms of services trade. So it's definitely an important area. This is all part and parcel of stage one of the negotiations. It goes side by side with the negotiations on merchandise trade, the services trade, and effectively sectors like telecommunications, ITC, business services, they're all part of those phase one negotiations. I was pleasantly surprised to see, some of the least developed countries in our sub-region actually already putting in their offers in terms of the service sector negotiations, liberalizations. But I do think we're going to see that this process of service sector liberalization is going to take longer than we're going to see with merchandise goods, for the simple reason that it's a lot more complicated liberalization in services sector. Again, going back to the European experience, even after 2 decades of the single market program, they did a report in 2010 to show that the service sector trade hadn't been liberalized to the same extent as merchandise trade in the European Union. So there will be difficulties along the way, and it will be a long-term process, but there's definitely a lot of benefits from the region from greater liberalization in sectors such as you say in telecommunications.
Okay, great job. Very interesting. Attilia, maybe something slightly different. How do you think we embrace emerging technologies? Things like artificial intelligence and 4IR, which we're talking so much about, at the moment. How do we embrace those to, make this trade area more successful, perhaps?
That's a great question, and I think that it's probably one of the opportunities that is sometimes overlooked. From our perspectives, and obviously maybe I'm highly biased because I work in the tech space, we see technology as an enabler, really something that can help accelerate some of our aspirations, right? Where the physical movement of goods is something that takes a lot more capacity to do, and is a lot more capital intensive, et cetera, et cetera. The ability to leverage digital technologies already to push forward some of our trade opportunities is something that I think is at least from a tech, as in from our ecosystem perspective, is something that we see as a real opportunity. And I'll give a couple of examples, right? I look at some of the really like the unicorns or the stars in the form of startups that we've had on the continent, whether the likes of an M-Pesa in East Africa, right? And just what it has done within the mobile payment space, but also the type of trade that it has enabled, right? Because people are able to make these mobile payments and therefore do some of the transactions that likely would have been a lot more difficult to do in the past. I look as well at the likes of a Jumia, the e-commerce platform, and how they're bringing goods from across the market, as in from across the region into different countries, and just the opportunity that e-commerce platforms like that have provided, right? As in the scale of an Amazon today in the US is also, based on a lot of the work that they do within e-commerce. And then there's others who are playing within the payment space and revolutionizing fintech in ways that I think are important. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for technology to be an enabler of some of those trade ambitions that we have.
Okay, great, Jo. Tilly, I'm going to stay with you because I want to talk a bit more about, startups and SMEs and the opportunities there. I mean, which sectors do you think are most likely, to grow the fastest and be helped by this? Obviously, fintech has been so successful already on the continent, and the idea of, opening things up more could be really great for that kind of sector. But what are the other sectors are we looking at? Like agri-tech kind of things, e-commerce,
Yeah, actually, interesting enough, we're spending a lot of time in the agriculture space. So looking at agri-tech opportunities, and part of this is, I think, food security is something that's of concern, not just in East Africa, but probably continent-wide, right? And with the increase in deforestation or desertification, and then the weather patterns are really becoming quite erratic. We have areas that are succumbing to drought quite significantly. Food security then becomes a very important focus for a lot of countries. And so we're spending a lot of time engaging with those who are working in agri-tech. So I feel like that's one area where there's a lot of opportunity for technology to really transform how we've been in the past managing the value chains in agriculture. I think healthcare is the other one that really, as COVID taught us, right, that there was actually a lot of opportunity in that space. Traditionally, we had seen a lot of resistance in the use of technology as a part of healthcare delivery. In a lot of our countries, concerns around this is really sensitive data, et cetera, we can't leverage some of these new technologies in that space. But the interesting things when COVID happened, we all had to pivot in many ways. And so you saw a heavy reliance on technology, even in health service delivery. So I think that's another very interesting opportunity. And I think as well, even in the energy space, which is how I understand even those within oil and gas are now referring to themselves more as, playing within the energy space. There's a lot of opportunity there as well for technology to really to disrupt just the value chains and how they've been operating in the past, but I think as well to support some of the sustainable energy efforts. So we're investing a lot as well in sustainability related technology. And I think many other tech companies are doing the same. So I'd say those are some of the areas from a continental perspective, just thinking of some of the key industries we have, of course, with financial services at the forefront.
Yeah, for sure. Andrew, kind of what's your take on all of this? And, how do you think we improve access to things like funding and training and talent for these kind of sectors as, these kind of startups grow?
Yeah, I've got a couple of observations really on this theme. Firstly, I was listening to a very interesting presentation a few years ago by the former Secretary General of UNCTAD, our sister organization in Geneva, SG Kituye, who's a Kenyan national, and he was talking about how, despite the great spread of social media across the continent, actually the revenue there wasn't any revenue being generated for governments across the continent. And I think that is a concern that when we look at the trends in a lot of internet-based services, where the revenue streams are going. So that's one thing that needs to be considered, I think, and could be discussed perhaps. Secondly, I know there's a lot of emphasis about startups and small firms in discussions on the continental free trade area, but I would beg to differ a little bit. That the fact is that currently trade tends to be driven by the larger companies. So, for example, in a country like Rwanda, where I'm currently at, there was a survey a few years ago. I think about 8 or 9 companies are responsible for about 90% of all exports, and that's a common pattern you'll see across the continent. So larger companies do actually contribute the bulk of trade. One other survey by the World Bank in Tanzania found of small enterprises, that's to say companies less than 20 people, only 3 or 4% of them were exported. So actually currently the patterns of trade globally and also on the continent is that it's driven by the larger actors. And I think initially the continental free trade area needs to focus on the concerns and the needs of those larger actors, just to raise those levels of intra-regional trade in a very pronounced way. Now, that doesn't mean that the ecosystem for the small and medium-sized companies is not important. It's fundamentally important for competitiveness, but I see more those companies as feeding in as suppliers of intermediate goods and services to the larger companies that will do the bulk of the trading. So I think that's the way to move things forward more quickly and rapidly on the continent.
Okay, and then maybe just tell me a bit more about, how the investment negotiations, are going, and what kind of will be the ultimate consequences of those.
The investment negotiations haven't started yet, as far as I'm aware, because they're stage 2. So we need to, finalize the stage 1 investment negotiations. But as I said before, cross-border investment is one of the fastest, most rapid ways of increasing intra-African integration. Globally, you will see that a lot of transactions are actually intra-firm transactions. So, for example, if you were to have Volkswagen Southern Africa investing more heavily in Eastern Africa, you would probably see a rapid increase in intermediate goods and services being provided amongst that company. So I think that's one of the fastest ways to actually facilitate things. And we don't need to lose sight of the profitable opportunities. The Financial Times published just yesterday a list of some of the fastest growing firms in terms of revenue across the continent. And clearly ICT and finance were very high on that list. Some manufacturing companies were also there. There was a disproportionate amount of mineral companies, but that was, I think, because they were 2020 figures, and I think it was affected by the global rising gold prices that year. But in any case, there's a lot of profitable opportunities for investors across the continent, and we need that level of cross-border investment to rise very substantially, I think, to make this work properly. Okay, thanks so much. Attilia, obviously we talk a lot about skills also in Africa, and there's this perception that there's a big skills gap. But when you talk to, all the kind of tech companies, they talk about the amazing skills we actually do have on the continent. So how do you think we're sort of working to upskill the youth, and how is that going to play into, all the trade going forward?
This is a difficult one because I think from a private sector perspective, and as well, a lot of governments that we engage with across the continent are grappling with this. So we have great talent on the continent, but I don't think we're churning them out fast enough, if that even makes sense, particularly within the digital space. So, and we're talking about at the higher end of technical skills, right? As in, so people who can do things like software engineering and highly technical work like that. So not necessarily someone who has the ability to, use I'll use Microsoft terms, like, for example, to use Word or Excel or PowerPoint. I mean, those are like intermediate skills that we almost believe any person in the professional sense should likely have, some sort of those fundamental skills. At that high end engineering talent, I think we're not churning out as much as we would hope, but there's a lot of steps that are being taken. I'll give the example of Kenya. I think they're setting up a facility together with the South Korean government, that is similar in structure to MIT. So where they, I guess they'll be hoping to attract some of the more highly skilled engineering talent on the continent for different master's programs and specializations. That'll be great to see what comes out of that. We're seeing a lot of our peers as well setting up either research or development facilities on the continent. I think that's another way of skills development, because giving the opportunity for engineers to work on the cutting edge of technology development also creates program that scales up the ecosystem, because they go back then into the ecosystem, we get new people, and we're kind of building a talent pool of really highly skilled technical people. And then at the university level, I know from a Microsoft perspective, our education teams have been engaged as well in supporting governments thinking through their curricula, introducing more digital or technology related courses into curricula, even from a, K-12, or I'm not sure what term you would use in different countries, right? As in from your grade 0 through to matric from a South African perspective, right? So I think there's a lot of work that's ongoing, but we're probably not even churning out that as much as the demand is currently in market, which is a good place to be, because it means that there's a lot of work still to do.
Yeah, and Andrew, what's your take kind of on this kind of aspect, and then also just how you were talking about the free movement of people that kind of plays into the skills thing, right?
Indeed, yes, that was my comment I was going to make. Yes, I mean, I think the quickest way to address a lot of the skill shortages across the continent is for more member states to actually sign up and ratify the free movement protocol. It's the most effective way, really, of addressing the kind of shortages that a lot of companies complain of, because across the continent we know we have a lot of talented young graduates. They simply are not able to find productive work in their own particular country, but allowing them to move, I think, would be the quickest way, really, to address a lot of the skills shortages we see across the continent. And it will be an amazing opportunity as well for the young people across the continent.
Yeah. While I have you, Andrew, I'm just also curious about what you think about, e-commerce. Obviously, you're talking about big companies will be the ones who possibly, we have to focus on first, but e-commerce kind of goes from the tiny company to the biggest company. How are we going to make that easier so that things can sort of get traded across the continent? We can see, big e-commerce giants growing, maybe African, started ones.
Yes, I mean, I'm not an expert on that particular theme. I'm more of an old-fashioned economist looking at merchandise trade, I confess. But clearly, I think the pandemic has accelerated the digital developments across the continent now. And just here in Rwanda, we've seen a lot of business startups during the pandemic to provide services to customers that way. So, I mean, it's definitely going to accelerate, I think, in the next few years, globally and particularly on this continent. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I know we're running out of time, but Natalia, I just want to ask you one more thing, just kind of about cybersecurity and cybercrime, and what kind of policies we need in place to make sure that doesn't increase with the increase of trade.
I think we've already started to see an increase in vulnerabilities within the cyberspace and attacks, even particularly during the COVID timeframe. It was quite sad to see they were particularly targeted cyber attacks. But I think the one thing that I would say would be interesting to see in the conversations on implementation of the agreement is how we can create more coordinated efforts across the continent. Because part of the vulnerabilities that they're taking advantage of are the fact that we're not necessarily communicating or sharing threat information across our continent, and or sharing then our intelligence, or even those who have then the experience either of mitigating such risks and or how to handle things of that nature. We're not sharing that expertise in a way that is that will likely reduce the ability of those who are, the bad actors within this space. So I think there's an opportunity for a coordinated effort around cybersecurity overall, and maybe a more harmonized approach on the regulation relating to cybersecurity and data protection. And then maybe the last thing that I would say is taking learnings from international standards as well. There's probably something that's an opportunity for us. There's other countries across the globe are facing similar issues, and international standards organizations have really kind of developed a practice and guidance that could be leveraged. And I think the adoption of the same would really be helpful as well on the continent.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. We run out of time for today, but I hope everyone's enjoyed the session and learned something new. I certainly have learned a lot. So thanks very much to our panelists today, to Andrew Mould from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and to Attilia Puri from Microsoft. Thanks very much for sharing your insights and your time with us today. That's all from me. I hope you have a great day and enjoy the rest of East Africa Com, and hopefully we will see you in person in Nairobi next year. Cheers.